I have to admit, cheekily, I'm quite glad that Annette's presentation was short and to the point, because I'm fairly famous in speaking circles for overrunning massively and having far too many slides, and this time is no exception. That's why I usually get only invited once to a particular conference and never again. Right, getting touchy. I'll move the mouse pointer out of the way for now. Oh, piss off. Right. Getting touchy, an introduction to touch and pointer events. So it was quite a nice segue, seeing the kind of slightly more crazy kind of spectrum of, we can have loads of different inputs like gamepads, drumstick type based navigation, everything else. This is probably a bit of an anticlimax. I'm going to take you back down to mostly how to work with touchscreen based stuff. Let's see. A lot of the material in this talk is based on the fact that I used to work for Opera here in Oslo, working remotely. And about 2 or so years ago, I started, for my sins, to look at some of the techniques that are involved with the JavaScript-based side of handling touch and touch events, and what the kind of differences are between the implementations and everything else. So over the last 2 years, I've been writing loads and loads of little tests, usually for myself, so I'm quite sad that way. I haven't really got a life. I spent my Fridays testing what events in particular are being fired when you, say, tap on a button, and if it's not a button, what if it's a div with on-click behaviors and everything else. So I've spent a lot of my time, sadly, digging into this sort of stuff. Let's see if the remote actually works. Yeah. And just recently, I've also compiled, after 2 years or so of just keeping loads of notes on little pieces of paper everywhere, I've compiled it all into a nice compatibility table, kind of PPK style. And there's a lot of weird and interesting information there. And as I said, a lot of the material that you'll see in my slides comes from those 2 misspent years of doing this kind of stuff. And yes, I have far too much material in my slides to cover, but even now that I'm going to steal a bit of time off Annette's slot, there's a lot of stuff in there. The idea is I want to have the slide set as complete as possible. I'll probably be jumping over some slides or going very, very quickly. I'll only touch very briefly on certain points, but please refer back to the slides later on, because I won't have time to really dig into the depths of things. But there's loads of demos, everything's online, and you can then peruse it at your own leisure. So what kind of sent me off on this crazy journey was, back when I was working as developer relations at Opera, I would go to various conferences, and a lot of developers would say, very straightforward questions. Well, you know, there are these things now with touchscreens. I don't know if you've heard of them. How can I make sure that my website actually works reasonably? In most cases is you don't really need to do anything in particular. And that's no surprise, because browsers on modern web browsers on modern touchscreen devices are built to run the web as it is today. With a lot of legacy websites and even current websites that pretty much only react to things like mouse events, mouse overs, that sort of stuff. So these browsers on touch devices, by default, by their very nature, emulate mouse events. This is the sort of tests, or variations on these sort of things that I've been doing over the last 2 years. But very simply, if we have a touch device, I've hooked up listeners to that button, and if we tap that on a touchscreen device, we see that, yes, it fires, the classic mouse events that you'd expect: mouse enter, mouse over, mouse move, mouse down, mouse up, and click. It fires them in a very fast sequence, but they pretty much all get sent to your script. And here they are again. One thing to note, there are kind of intricacies depending on exactly where you've got your listeners. In general, you only get a single sacrificial mouse move, and we'll come back to that later because that causes certain problems. But in general, this is the lay of the land. So if you've got a page that is relatively simple, it doesn't do a lot of fancy stuff like, I don't know, drawing applications or something. You've got a website, you've got a few scripts that listen to some of those events, you're usually fine. You don't have to do much to make it actually at least baseline work on a touch device. The event sequence itself changes slightly depending on whether it's the first tap or you tap a second time, and when you tap away, mostly to do with setting and unsetting focus as you would normally in a web page. And there are kind of variations on the theme. So this emulation works in most cases. As I said, if you've got a very simple website, maybe just a few forms, stuff like that, nothing too interactive, it works, but it is limiting and in some cases problematic. There's probably more, but I'm only going to concentrate on two particular problems. Delayed event dispatch and the fact that Mousemove doesn't track. So delayed event dispatch. You're probably all aware of this already, but I'm just going to mention it anyway. Yes, mouse events are being fired. So if I'm listening to, say, click, as I would traditionally on any interactive elements, because I want to make sure that it works with the mouse and the keyboard. So I'm listening to click, I tap on that particular button, and yes, I do get a click event, but there is a little bit of a delay. The delay, it varies depending on the phase of the moon, what the weather's like, but it usually is around 300 milliseconds. We'll go with that. And the second problem is that Mousemove doesn't track. And I'm going to tempt the demo gods now and actually go into it. I've preloaded them all, but I'll probably end up losing them halfway through. So here's a stupid demo, just with Canvas, and I'm listening to Mousemove, and I'm making kind of 70s pop art kind of artwork here for you. That works great. If I now reload, oops, I'll move the mouse out of the way first. If I reload, and this is actually a touchscreen laptop, if I start moving my finger over, you'll see that nothing is actually happening. Only if I tap and release and don't move, you'll see something happens. And that's because, as I mentioned before, there's only one single mouse move that's being fired in a tap sequence. If I move the finger around, it's not actually sending any of those mouse compatibility events at all. And it doesn't even send that individual mouse move. So if my fantastic website to create 70s pop art kind of stuff relies on that, it will not work if I just rely on Mousemove in this particular case. That one's all right. Plenty more demos to mess up. So yeah, that's the point. If I do it on a touch device, this will happen. iOS has got a weird bug, iOS 7, that it does seem to fire Mousemove when it's also scrolling, but that's a completely separate level of pain, scrolling and touch and how events are firing. Luckily, I've only spent 2 years looking at clean taps for the most part. I'll probably spend the next 10 years looking at what happens with scrolling. So we'll see you, Web Rebels 2024. So really, we've seen two problems. Yeah, we can rely on mouse, but it's a little bit limiting. There are some issues. So we need to go deeper. And for that, we need touch events. They were introduced by the first iPhone. There was a whole talk of you want to actually do native apps. It's all going to be JavaScript kind of web apps that you're going to have. But then Apple realized they can't actually monetize web apps, so they decided to do the App Store and everything else. But yeah, they invented touch events, basically, Apple. And then they were kind of retrofitted and adopted by pretty much all other browsers, with one exception, which we'll get to. So Chrome, Firefox, Opera, etc. have it, and it was retrospectively also specified as a W3C specification. There was a bit of saber rattling, we call it. Apple were kind of making noises about, oh, we got patents on this and everything else. It was all resolved, and yeah, there is an actual W3C spec that says touch events, which really just kind of codifies what Apple invented and what most browsers also implemented in their browsers. So touch events, we've got no big surprises. We've got touch start. The A finger is touching, is going onto the touch screen. Touch move, it's moving around. Touch end is when the finger is lifted again. Touch cancel is fired usually when, for whatever reason, the touch is interrupted. Now, classic example would be, I don't know, my finger moved outside of whatever the web view is, or the browser popped up some kind of dialogue, and that pretty much signals, okay, well, I can't track any more touch events. There were also, in the very early stages, touch enter and touch leave, which will be kind of the touch equivalent of the mouse enter, mouse leave. Mouse enter, mouse leave aren't supported on all desktop browsers with mouse. Touch enter, touch leave wasn't supported pretty much anywhere, from what I remember. So they are not part of the spec. But I just thought, in case you come across them, that's legacy stuff. There was talk of having touch enter, touch leave at some point. They were just too expensive for doing like hit calculations as you're moving through, the page with your finger. If we look again, with these boring tests that I wasted my last 2 years with, what the sequence of events is, we know we got touch events, we know we got the mouse events. what's the actual sequence. And yeah, every now and again you'll see I also come across, obviously, bugs, and I file them. So if you're really sad, you can go and look up what the problem is in iOS with mouse enter. Basically, this is the lay of the land in general. We get the touch events, touch start, a few touch moves. You know, as long as you don't move your finger too much, it still counts as a tap. So you might get 2 or 3. Touch end, I lift my finger again. And then you get the various mouse compatibility events and the click at the end. Now, these are only fired, the mouse events and the click are only fired if it's a single finger. As soon as I start doing things with 2 fingers, I will only get the touch events. Because the OS itself, or the browser, assumes it's not really an activation if I all of a sudden have 2 or 3 fingers. I'm probably trying to do some kind of gesture rather than an actual tap on things. Again, variations depending on whether it's the first tap or the second tap or I'm tapping away. But again, no big surprises there. The differences are mainly, again, about moving the focus onto the button the first time. Second time, the focus is assumed to be already there. And then tapping away, you get the mouse out. And in some cases, mouse leave, and in some cases, blur. If you want to know exactly where, you can have a look at my compatibility tables. But you probably don't rely on those anyway. There are further kind of problems or differences. As I mentioned already, too many touch moves. If you're moving your finger too much, it doesn't count as a tap anymore. So the mouse compatibility events are not being fired by the browser. So after touch end, it basically just stops and doesn't send the mouse enter, etc., etc. Too many touch moves can generate a touch cancel in certain browsers for no good reason. And not all browsers actually send touch move consistently, at least. And then some browsers are completely batshit crazy, in my opinion anyway. So you got things like Browser, the traditional thing before they had Chrome in Android as the default. Browser in Android 4.3, so not even something ancient, but something that's probably still quite current. It will fire mouse over, mouse move, and then the touch events. And then for the 5 people in the world who got a BlackBerry Playbook, I'm one of them. It's an exclusive club, guys and girls. You get touch start, and then it fires mouse events, and then touch end and mouse up. So doesn't seem to be any big logic there. The real takeaway from all of this stuff, and probably from my last 2 years, is really hard-coded in the spec. And there's a lot of variations in different browsers, how they fire the events when they fire them. But it's good to know that, you know, things are a bit flaky. As I said, if you want to know the details, have a look at my test results page. So now we know we got touch events. How do they help us with these limitations and problems that we've seen before? As a reminder, delayed event dispatch and Mousemove not tracking. So delayed event dispatch, we know that there's a delay. Why is there a delay? There are a few reasons, but the main one is it's to enable double tap to zoom. Because in your browser, well, browsers on a touchscreen device, fingers actually overloaded. With a single finger, you're doing a lot of things. You're activating things, you're scrolling things, that sort of stuff, or you long press to bring up context menus. There are a lot of interactions, but one of the key interactions is double tapping to zoom in. Now, if the browser didn't wait those 300-ish milliseconds, it would have no way of knowing, was this, you know, the finger went down, the finger went up again. Is this an actual tap? Does the user want to activate this? Or is this only the first of a double tap sequence? So pretty much all browsers wait roughly about 300 milliseconds to see, is there another tap coming? And if not, then they go, okay, well, right, this was a tap. I'll send the mouse compatibility events and trigger the scripts that are still listening for, you know, click and mouse over, etc., etc. What if browsers didn't wait? As I said, most browsers do it. I found an interesting one, Puffin. Seems to be a popular in Korea, apparently, Android browser. This one doesn't wait 300 milliseconds. So you get into interesting situations where with my test button, if I double tap it, it will fire the events and then zoom in at the same time, which is very likely not what you actually intended the user to be able to do, and the user probably would be a bit surprised what's going on. But not everybody's going to install Puffin and try it. For the lols, you can actually set a flag in Chrome, which is the disable click delay. So you can do that on your Android phones yourselves, and have a look and see how shit the web would be without the 300 millisecond delay if you want to also zoom into stuff. When does the delay actually happen? I'm going to have a little sip before I dehydrate. Right. So when does the delay happen? We know it happens. Where is it? Again, we can run tests. I think this part is in the specification. We'll see that. I think the next one makes it clearer. We see that this is the event sequence that we get, touch events and mouse events, and the delay. So we get touch start, a few touch moves, touch end, are pretty much fired immediately as they happen, as my finger touches the screen, as it moves, as it lifts. They happen right away. Then the delay, and then if there wasn't a second tap, you get the mouse events and everything else. So the million-dollar question, how can I make sure that, 300 milliseconds isn't a lot, but it is felt. If you've got a web application, the user, it won't feel like a giant delay, but it will just feel like it's a bit unresponsive, not in terms of responsive design, but in terms of it doesn't respond as immediately as I would expect, say, a native app to respond. So that's been a big concern, obviously, for people developing web applications for touchscreens. How can you make it go away, this 300 millisecond delay? Well, the naive answer, is, well, you need to react before the 300 millisecond delay, obviously. So you know that the touch events are firing right away. You could fire your events, your script directly at touch start for immediate controls. If you've got something like a game where you want to jump as soon as the user puts the finger on the screen rather than waiting for the user to lift the finger, for instance. Or in most cases, touch end. If you just want to make sure that, yes, you've got, say, button elements and stuff, and you just want to make sure that the user taps it, as soon as they lift the finger, it fires, that's where you want to listen for touch end. So that's a nice little simple idea. Little interlude, feature detection. You can detect touch events in browser, and this will lead to something else. Bear with me. There are variations. Older browsers in particular had some weird quirks that you can paper over by using things like Modernizer Touch, for instance. But in a very idealistic world where browsers follow standard, the browser supports touch events. Now, this kind of little nugget of information has been kind of used, and it's still being used, I see it every now and again, for a little performance trick. One weird trick to make your website work well on touch devices is something along these lines and variations of it. In essence, what this says is, if the browser supports touch events, I'm just going to listen for touch end. Otherwise, I'm going to listen for click, which, on the surface, looks fairly harmless. You're making the assumption that, yes, it supports touch events, it must be a touch device, so I'll just listen to that. 300 milliseconds are gone, users will be happy. The problem with that is you're making things touch exclusive if you're just dropping that little nugget of code, which I've seen in some kind of performance libraries and stuff as well. Because, that was the explanation. Because basically it relies on the fact that if touch events are supported, you're only listening to touch because you're assuming that where touch events are supported, it's a purely touchscreen-based device. But there are a lot of hybrid devices now out and about. I've got my presentation machine here that's got keyboard, trackpad, and a touchscreen. Windows 8, the whole thing from the ground up, and Windows RT, they're built from the ground up on the idea that you're not going to have touch and mouse and keyboard and everything else. Chromebook Pixel, for those who can afford it, same kind of deal. It's a very nice machine. It's got a trackpad and it's got a touchscreen. And if you think it's only laptops, so still slightly mobile in that sense, you now get desktop machines. Here's one from Dell. I think that's a 24-inch screen. It's an all-in-one computer, so you put your CDs on the side. It's a bit shit. But this is not, in any sense of the word, a mobile device. It has a touchscreen. Users will still use the mouse, but they will also, for certain things, use the touchscreen. I surprised myself with this laptop. For certain things, I just use the touchscreen, and then I switch back to using the trackpad or the mouse or the keyboard. So after a while, users will actually fluidly, whatever feels comfortable to them, use that. And then I go back to my Mac, and I try to tap my LCD, and nothing happens, which is a bit disappointing. But this is nothing new. That you had devices like the HTC Hero, yes, touchscreen, but it had that little knobbly bit there, the little trackball. So you already had a device that, yes, is normally a touchscreen device, but it actually has different input modalities as well. And you get those weird transformer-y type. Yes, it runs Android, so you could think it's kind of like a phone or a tablet, but then with an actual docking station to turn it into a real laptop. And you can also have a pure kind of touchscreen device, a phone or a tablet, but in many situations you're able to pair, say, a Bluetooth mouse with it or a Bluetooth keyboard. And what is the lay of the land there? That's part of what I've been also testing. So in certain situations you're safe. Android and a mouse behaves pretty much like touch. So you get into a weird situation where a mouse attached to Android pretends to be a finger, which then in the browser then pretends to be a mouse afterwards. So you get kind of a weird chain of emulation. But if you did the assumption of, if touch events are supported, I'm only listening to touch end, you're safe in this situation. However, for us BlackBerry Playbook users, 10 of us, if you attach a mouse there, all of a sudden it behaves exactly like desktop. It just fires the mouse events. So an optimization that says if touch events are supported, which they are on this device, I'll only listen to touch end, you've immediately killed any opportunity of using a mouse. Android and a keyboard. Some people, they might have a disability or they just might like it that way. We don't know it. Can attach a Bluetooth keyboard, and it will be the same situation for those transformer-style laptops that are based on Android. If you use a keyboard to navigate, so tab and shift-tab to move their focus sequentially, enter to activate, it will only fire focus and click. So again, it supports touch, but you've basically killed it by only listening to touch end. And we can then go into the whole area of accessibility. iOS on an iPhone with VoiceOver. Yes, I can. Here I'm safe. Again, probably as a self-defense mechanism, iOS and VoiceOver, if you're running in a browser, it will still pretend to actually fire touch events. But the equivalent on Android, if you're running TalkBack, which is the equivalent kind of screen reading software there, all of a sudden it sends events that are more akin to a keyboard or a mouse. So once again, this will be a situation where the naive, it supports touch, I'll just listen to touch, would completely fall on its arse. Or rather, the user will fall on their arse. I've written about this before at length, so there's an article there on the Mozilla blog for it. But really, fundamentally what it means is that this feature detection, you need to understand what it actually detects. It means that the browser supports touch events. It doesn't mean it's a pure touchscreen device. It doesn't mean the user will only ever use touch. It might even be, well, by default, it should have been there even in browsers when there isn't a live touchscreen there, because this is only a feature detect. Does it have the code inside it to handle touch events? But there were too many sites breaking because of those assumptions. For instance, Chrome now have some extra heuristics that on startup, they look, is there a live touchscreen? If so, expose touch events, otherwise don't, which goes against what feature detection normally does, which is just test the capability. But they had to do it defensively. But that doesn't cover the case where, I don't know, I've got a KVM switch, and I switch from my dumb display to a touchscreen display, or I just plug it in. That is not supported. So really the takeaway after looking at all these different devices and events they fire really is that there's still a lot of thinking about pigeonholing devices and pigeonholing browsers and users into this is either a touch device or a mouse user, or this is I don't know, somebody who's blind using a keyboard. Great. But as devices are becoming, the limits between devices are becoming far more fluid, the boundaries are becoming more fluid, we really need to start thinking more about touch and mouse and keyboard. There's no way anymore to really pin down and say this is only a touch device, it will only ever be a touch device, because people can just mix and match and add inputs and everything else. So classically, how you deal with that sort of thing is you double up your event listeners. So instead of just listening for either touch end or click, listen to both. Great. Problem is you might end up firing the same function twice. Actually, I'll go back there. So it will fire, say, a tap on the screen. If I fire something on touch end, but then if I don't prevent the mouse compatibility events, the same function will also be executed on the click after the 300 milliseconds. So you can dedupe that by using prevent default on anywhere on the touch sequence, usually on touch start. And that basically signals to prevent default is a big hammer. By issuing a prevent default, you're killing pretty much everything that the browser normally does. So it's not just the 300 millisecond delay, you're also stopping scrolling, pinch to zoom, etc. So it's a pretty hefty thing to be doing. So apply it carefully if you have to, just on, surgically on the button that you want to make more responsive, or the link, or whatever it is. Don't just do it on the entire page and think you're doing great work, because then you have to re-implement scrolling and everything else from basic principles, which is not fun. There are nice ready-made scripts. A very popular one is FastClick by the team that built the Financial Times mobile application, which really is just a mobile website. So they had to wrangle with a lot of the stuff, because there are some edge cases, certain versions of Android browser. If it's a button, it will only fire this rather than that, and how to detect it. Again, nobody's got time for that shit. FastClick, again, papers over that sort of stuff. So if you have to do it, grab it, it's ready-made. And browsers are actually working to remove this 300 millisecond delay, because that's been apparently the biggest problem in the mobile space, if you start looking at the amount of solutions that are out there. So browsers are aware of that. And particularly, browsers have been working on removing this delay when the page is not zoomable, because mostly that delay is there for double tap to zoom. If the page isn't zoomable, then there's no need to wait, because do it using the viewport meta or the CSS equivalent app viewport directive, which some browsers are now starting to support as well. If you say very brutally, use a scalable no for the particular page, browsers, mostly Chrome and Firefox, will actually remove that 300 millisecond delay. So without doing any further working with prevent default, doubling up event listeners, listening for touch end and everything else, you can still just listen to click and be done with it. That's the equivalent in Firefox, just to show that the same happens there. A more abstruse way of saying it, if your minimum scale and your maximum scale are exactly the same, you're basically saying you can't zoom this in a slightly more poetic way. That is also optimized away, again, in Chrome and in Firefox. For the 12 users who are migrating from BlackBerry Playbook to Firefox OS, that wasn't implemented. Those optimizations weren't there for the longest time, but that is now apparently fixed after I reported it. And I think last time I checked it was in Firefox OS 1.1. Apparently in 2, 3, and going forward, that's now being fixed. So that's something valid that you can do there as well. Now, what about accessibility? Yes, we can say this page can't zoom, and we're happy because that means we've killed those 300 millisecond delays. What about accessibility? Yes, in general, you don't really, it's a bit frowned upon to say, right, this page can't zoom, because if a user does need to zoom, you're basically stopping them from using your page, enjoying your content. Now, some browsers, Chrome and I think Browser, have an extra setting in their options that says force enable zoom, which basically says ignore anything that the meta viewport says. If the user wants to zoom, let them zoom. Once you do that, the 300 millisecond delay returns, but the user is able to zoom. It's a reasonable compromise. You can say, by default, we'll assume users don't need to zoom. They have to make the choice themselves. They have to opt into, I want to be able to zoom everywhere. You could kind of argue that, maybe not. And then, but if they need to, then we'll need to add that 300 millisecond delay. Fair enough. Danger, though, is not every browser does it. Firefox, from what I've seen on, say, Android, doesn't have any force-enable zoom kind of option. So, as usual, particularly with accessibility, you have to weigh up the pros and cons on that particular one. Now, Chrome, the Chrome team, obviously, their performance is their mantra, And they've tried variations on how can we make it even, roll this optimization out even further. We don't want developers having to stop zooming. We want to do it kind of automagically out of the box. And they've proposed, and they implemented, that if a site actually does the width equals device width meta viewport, which is pretty much standard now if you're doing anything responsive design-wise, that assumes this site is mobile optimized. It kind of takes the assumption at that point the developer will have done the right thing, or the designer, and content will be big enough. So they kind of optimize away the 300 millisecond and stop double tap to zoom there as well. It's a bit contentious. It doesn't stop pinch zoom, so if a user doesn't need to, they can still actually use 2 fingers and zoom in. So it's kind of a softer big hammer that users are being hit with. Not as painful, but there will still be some situations. Use with caution. And Mozilla are also implementing that, or have. I think it's, resolved fixed, so it might come out in the next version of, I think the Firefox beta that just came out on Android has that. So again, if you're doing width equals device width, all of a sudden, magically, the 300 millisecond delay is gone. Now, what about a browser that some people use? Anything on iOS? Well, unfortunately, no. All of those cool, slightly less evil ways of doing things without JavaScript and prevent default, they don't work at all in iOS. Safari and, of course, web views, which are every other browser on iOS. Now, I've inquired about this with WebKit people, and apparently, done a show of hands, who knows, who's got an iOS device and knows about double tap to scroll? Excellent. So just because of view, there is a feature in iOS where even when the site doesn't actually zoom, double tap works as a scrolling mechanism. So it kind of brings up the bit where you double tap, saying, well, we can't really remove this because it's still a useful feature. It's being discussed at the moment. We'll see how it goes. But yeah, so unfortunately, after all the cool things that I've shown you, you could do this. You can set the viewport. Currently, for iOS, you still have to do the lengthy way of listening for touch end, preventing default, etc. It's a painful world. Right, so that was delayed event dispatch, which pretty much is like 3/4 of a talk, I'm afraid. So things won't go into as much detail now. You'll be happy to hear. And anyway, I'm just before lunch, so once I see you approaching the stage with pitchforks because you're really hungry, I'll make my exit. Right, second problem, Mousemove doesn't track. That's quite straightforward. We've seen the demo. I can do it with the mouse. If I touch on the screen, it only pops those bubbles when I do a clean tap, because that's the only time when Mousemove is being fired. But we've seen that we've got touch start, touch move, and everything else. Now, how can we use those? Well, again, we've seen the same thing previously for how can we react to the tap before the delay. Similar kind of solution, we just double up our event handling. Yes, we listen to mouse move for when there is a mouse, and we listen to touch move, which fires continuously as I move my finger around the screen. So your initial naive bit of code, taken from my little canvas pop art generator, it's basically, bare bones is this. I'll listen for mouse move, and then I get the client X and client Y and do something interesting with that. Now, if I just double up the event listener and still send it to the same function, I still need to handle, obviously, mouse and touch there. Now, there is a slight problem. If I just did this with the code that I had originally for mouse, nothing will happen on touch. And that's because for mouse, going back to kind of basic principles, if you're listening to a mouse event, this is the object that you get back. You get your screen X, screen Y, client X, client Y, plus the kind of extended mouse event attributes on the object, like page X, page Y, offset X, offset Y, which were there kind of for compatibility reasons, because I think IE implemented some, and Netscape, Navigator or something, and there's still legacy code out there. So basically, these are the kind of things you get. But with touch events, if you listen to a touch event, the event object you get back is actually this. So you'll notice there aren't any coordinates in that initial event that you're getting. What you do get is a whole new thing here, which are touch lists. And that's because By default, touch events are set out to be multi-touch enabled. Yes, with a mouse, you only got an X and a Y coordinate, but if you've got multiple fingers on the screen, you've got multiple kind of touch points. Inside the actual touch lists, you then get individual touches which have the traditional X and Y kind of coordinates. The difference between those different touch lists, it's a bit weird, it's a bit hacky, this whole idea. Even if I just touch, say, I've got listeners on my button, which in most cases in my examples I have, and I only touch it with one finger, and I've got fingers anywhere else on the screen, in the object, I still get something back there, touches, that gives me an overview of any finger anywhere in the page. It's kind of a super global of these are the different touches, not just the ones relating to the object that I'm actually got my listener on. So those are the touches anywhere on the screen. Target touches are the touches that started on the element in question that I've got my listener on. Started meaning that, once I tap on the element and move it while I'm still touching the screen, move it out, I can still track that. So it's kind of capturing that particular finger implicitly, and I get it in target touches. And change touches is basically, out of all the touches on the screen, which are the ones that caused this particular event that I'm now processing to fire. So even though I have 3 fingers, if one is on the element and I move that, I wiggle that a bit, the touch move that I get, that is the change touches. The other ones are still there in the touches array and target touches, but change touches is usually the one that caused that actual event to fire. If you want to play with it, try it out visually. I've got a little demo there. I'm not going to double up our event listeners. We also then need to do a little bit of forking in our code and say, basically, if I'm getting client X and client Y in the object, great, use that. Otherwise, and here I'm making a really big assumption, I'll just listen to the first finger, effectively, for my drawing the things on the canvas. And I fire the prevent default to avoid firing it twice. And then, well, if it is of interest, just to show I'm not talking rubbish, here's the version optimized with exactly that kind of code. And now I can do pop art even with my finger. That'll be on my gravestone. Could do pop art with this finger. Right. So now we can track fingers. Great. Obviously, the next step is, well, we could do swipe gestures. Who doesn't like swipe gestures? Fairly basic, you just the delta of how much did I move my finger over delta time. If it's within a certain range, I can assume this was a swipe to the left or a swipe to the right. Super stupid example for that. I can do that with a few lines of JavaScript. You probably have code knocking about where you did that for mouse a few years ago. Just next to the folder with the mouse trails and the snowflakes. So you can pretty much adapt that code to do this sort of thing. Obviously, you can do something slightly more useful, like actual picture sliders, that sort of stuff. Straightforward enough to do. But don't forget, we talked before, if you remember, about 6 hours ago, we talked about there's mouse and keyboard and everything else. Don't make assumptions. So don't build your entire web application now. Everything will be swipeable. Yes, do it, but don't exclude users that aren't swiping. A good working example of that, and I hope I've preloaded that, of course I didn't, is, don't know, you probably know Brad Frost, you've heard of him? He works a lot in responsive design and everything else. And a good example that he's got here, this shows a lot more than just this. It shows, how designs adapt. But he's got a little, pretend store, and this has got little swipe-enabled carousel. But he's also still got these thumbnails here. So it's kind of progressive enhancement. If I've got touch, and maybe the site should show a little hint that there is a swipeable area there. But, in general, I can use my mouse, or I could use keyboard, tab to those, activate them. So it's about progressive enhancement, building on top of it, making sure that things work with mouse and touch and keyboard and everything else. Little warning, touch move, if you start tracking that, fires a lot, so particularly on older mobile devices. Try to do the absolute minimum on touch move. Don't try to redraw your entire canvas on every single touch move, because you're going to have a few thousand events happening, and you're going to clog up, as a second, and you're going to clog up particularly older devices. Usually, the absolute minimum is store coordinates, and then use something like set interval or request animation frame to actually fire, an update of the screen, depending on, how accurate, time sensitive your tracking needs to be. You can also think about debouncing or throttling events. There are ready-made scripts, was it limit.js, for instance, but there's probably far better ones. But yeah, if you don't need to listen to every single movement, but if every 10th will actually do that, save the CPU a bit of power. So yeah, a bit of work, save the power on the battery. So why stop at single points? We now know that we're getting lists of actual fingers, and we can just work through them, in a for loop or whatever you want to do. And you can do this party piece, which I've got somewhere here. Is it here? There we go. So you can do this kind of stuff, which is always a crowd pleaser. Come on, be pleased. Thank you. I pleased one person today. That'll be on my other gravestone. Being careful, though, obviously browsers fight against us at every opportunity. Strangely, Apple's browsers most of the time. iOS on iPad, it has a four-finger gesture to swipe between apps. You cannot prevent default that. There's no way to do it. There's even native app developers that are, you can't. It's just hard-coded in the OS. So anything above 3 fingers, you can't do in your application. As soon as you move like that, it will try to go to your next app. And with the rollout of iOS 7, there's now a gesture in Safari and web views, I think, where if you're close to the edge and swipe left and right, it will go backwards and forwards in history. A bit of like a time machine. But yeah, you can't prevent default that either, which is a pain. So if you're doing anything, keep away from the edges. You can't have something that's swipeable all across the touch surface. Obviously, you can then start doing multi-touch gestures. We know how to track a single finger and say this was a swipe. We can track multiple fingers. We can go all the way and start doing pinch zooming and everything else. Now, iOS actually has, Safari and WebView, has built-in functions that let you track gestures, gesture start, gesture change, gesture end. These are not part of the W3C retrospective specification, mainly because no other browser actually implements this. So it's purely iOS-based stuff. And yes, it's nice. You listen to it, and the event actually has scale and rotation values that you can plug directly into something like a transform, CSS transform, for instance. So it is nice, but basically, unless you're targeting purely iOS, just stay away from it. But you can just implement it with a bit of Pythagoras, a bit of basic principles. Again, this isn't rocket science. And you can end up with pretty but useless things like this, picture organizers. I'm tracking 2 fingers for rotation and zooming and everything else. Yeah, cool. Great stuff. So every website needs one of those, I'm sure. And being careful, yes, we can now do multi-touch gestures and everything else. It's all cool. But just be careful, because not every device, even modern ones, support a lot of multi-touch stuff. Again, my trusty HTC Hero, admittedly that's a few years old. If you put 2 fingers or 3 fingers or whatever on the screen, it can only track 1. So it's not multi-touch capable. But a little bit closer to us, that's only a few years back, LG Optimus 2X, Android 237, does something weird. If you put 2 fingers, or 3 or 4, it averages between those touch points. So it's kind of aware of them, but it only will fire the kind of geometric mean on that one. And even, very recently, the ZTE Open Firefox OS only has 2. If you put a 3rd finger on, it's not tracked. So 2 is, it's all right. You can do pinch zoom and everything else. So basically the takeaway is, yes, you can do gesture recognition, but don't go crazy on it. Don't assume that, even though it's a touch device, it will have full support for 10 or 11 fingers or whatever. Right, and now, super quickly, have I still got time, Jan? 15 minutes. 15 minutes. Well, there we go. I can relax. So I've mentioned right at the start, about an hour ago. That includes Q&A. Well, I'm giving you so much information, there will not be any questions, I'm sure. You know. Okay. Shit. Okay, so really quickly, and don't worry about the, this bit goes a lot quicker, mainly because I start panicking. I mentioned that pretty much all browsers implemented touch events. Invented by Apple, Chrome, Firefox, Opera, blah, 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 implemented it. One browser that didn't is Internet Explorer. And we can all go, oh yeah, Internet Explorer, great. Up until IE9, even on their mobile platform on WinPhone 7.5, I think they brought out a 7.8, but I've never actually seen it in the wild. All you had to go by were mouse events. So all the stuff right at the start that I said, browsers do this, but it's a bit limiting, that's all you had to work with. Even in their developer documentation, it basically said, do this, use mouse events, do this stuff. Now with IE10, Microsoft introduced a completely new technology called pointer events. And you know, when I first heard about it, I thought, here we go again, more proprietary kind of stuff. It's actually not that bad. There is now growing consensus between browsers that it's a good model. Mainly because, yes, you know, we got touch events that that are specific to touch. We've had mouse events for ages. And they kind of abstracted this. Instead of saying, yeah, let's just keep piling new event models on, instead they built a unifying kind of model, which is pointer events, which tries to abstract any way, anything that is a pointer, which could be a finger, a stylus, or a mouse, abstract that into a single set of standard events and the object that then comes with those events. So it's not a stupid idea. And it's not not invented here technology either. Again, that was my initial reaction, oh, it's proprietary. Now people are going to have to code, especially for IE, for this sort of stuff. As soon as they brought out IE10, they actually submitted pointer events to the W3C, so no Apple-style, you know, somebody else then spec'd it, and they said, we've got patterns, loads of aggro between browsers, you know, retrospectively implementing things. No, this was, from the start, they said, well, here's the spec, we're happy to have it worked on at the W3C. That was, which one? That's May 2013. I'm actually part of the working group as well. I've been working away there, bringing my little bit of knowledge into it as well. There's a editor's draft there. I think we're planning to push something out stable fairly soon. And when they released IE10 with pointer events, they also made a test version. Microsoft actually doing open source. They brought out a test version. Here's what it could look like in WebKit, and they made their own little, you know, standalone WebKit build that had at least the basics of pointer events as a proof of concept. So Microsoft doing open source, who would have thought that? Now, other browsers are actually kind of coming to the conclusion that it's not that bad. So in Chromium, the Chrome people themselves, there is now implement pointer events, so they are actively working towards that. Mozilla, same thing. There is a bug implementing it, it's very active. And yes, the pointer events working group, we have people from Mozilla, we have people from Chrome on there. We haven't got anybody from Apple, but we know that's the Apple way of doing things. There we go. So Apple, there is a bug implementing pointer events, resolved, won't fix. We'll see. Anyway, so how does it look in terms of what are the events that are being fired? I'm just going to go straight to this slide. This is what you get when you tap on something and it's got pointer events support. And you'll notice that, yes, it fires mouse compatibility events, but it fires them inline. So it's not doing first loads of touch, then it waits, and then there's mouse. You actually get them interleaved, happening pretty much at the same time. It's vendor prefixed in IE10, so all the MS, blah, blah, blah stuff. It's unprefixed in IE11, so it's fairly safe to use. IE11 also maps the prefixed version to the unprefixed version temporarily, just so if any code is already out there, they use the prefixed version, it will still work, but in the long run, you want to unprefix it. And the events that you get back from pointer events, instead of having a completely new object with touch lists like we saw in the touch events, it actually extends mouse. So you get exactly the same attributes there in the object that you would get for a mouse event, plus extra stuff that are specific to the pointer stuff itself. So you get all the magic client X, client Y, etc. There's a simple feature detect for it, if window pointer event, and then you know the browser supports pointer events. The one thing that it doesn't abstract, it abstracts touch and pen and mouse. Keyboard is still slightly weird. I had a philosophical argument with people saying, well, keyboard is kind of a pointer because as you're moving tab, you're moving a visual focus on the screen. It didn't fly. But okay, so keyboard you still have to do separate, but anything else that is kind of pointery, you can do with pointer events. Yes, and the one thing that I then insisted on is we put a little note in saying, don't forget keyboard. You can also, if the hardware doesn't lie, check how many touch points does the hardware currently support. So if it's more than 0, you know there is a touch screen, and this is actually now, it's not about it supports touch events, but this is really, the hardware reports that it supports more than 0 touch points. There is a touch screen somewhere here. And this, as far as I know, also dynamically changes. So if I plug a touchscreen monitor in, that value would change. There is no listener for that, so you'd still have to kind of poll it if that's what you want to do. Problems before. So how are pointer events better in probably 3 minutes, I'm going to tell you. And I'm biased because I'm on the working group, so take it with a pinch of salt. So from my point of view, I'm not a fantastic coder, but I like the fact that you don't have to build separate code for mouse and touch, like we saw before, forking the code, because you get exactly the same attributes in the event object back. There's no need for, oh, actually, that was a lie. Yeah, I can basically just listen to pointer move. I don't have to double up on listening to touch move and mouse move. That was the point of this slide. I don't have to then do anything extra to get the coordinates out, if that's what I want to do. Oops, did I jump? Yeah, so I get client X, client Y, if that's what I'm actually looking for. But I can distinguish. In general, as a developer, say I've got a button. I don't care how the user activated it, if it was with a nose on a touchscreen or something. All I care about is, well, the user wants to do something here, let's do it. But if I am doing something specific, or I want to do something, if it was a touch rather than a mouse, maybe bring up a contextual menu, or if it's a mouse, bring up a hover, but otherwise don't. I can do that, so it gives us the best of both worlds pointer events. It does give me pointer type as an extended attribute, and I can actually test, okay, was it a mouse, was it a pen, was it a touch? There might be more values in future, but those are the ones in the spec at the moment. And looking at the limitations we had before, the delayed event dispatch, yes, you still get the 300 millisecond delay. Of course you do. Particularly on, even on desktop, because in IE 10 and 11 actually do implement double tap to zoom on desktop on a touchscreen device. You could, well, there's a whole event list there. The delay happens right at the end, just before the click, rather than anywhere further up the chain. You could use a similar approach to what we had before. Oh, let's double up events and listen to pointer up instead of click. And how about using prevent default to then stop firing it twice? The problem is prevent default doesn't stop the click from firing. So that approach doesn't work, which, sad face. But what pointer events do is they actually include a new CSS-based property called touch action. And if you use that, it's got various values: auto, none, pan X, pan Y, and manipulation. And what that does is, in your CSS, you're basically saying what action should be possible by default, in terms of what the browser will handle itself. If you say none, it means I'm handling everything myself. So don't do any default action. If I say pan X, pan Y, yes, the user can just scroll it, and that should be handled by the browser. I'm handling everything else. And manipulation is the new special one that I'll mention in just a second. Again, same as prevent default. If I do touch action none, I'm basically saying I'm doing everything. So, scrolling, pinch zoom, etc. will be killed. Use with caution. Again, apply it to just what you need. Touch event manipulation is kind of a halfway house. It says, I want to allow the user to manipulate stuff, so pinch zooming, scrolling, and everything else, In effect, that is the one value that basically says, don't wait 300 milliseconds for a double tap to zoom. And that's basically what a lot of browsers are now implementing. So IE has implemented that. As soon as I put touch action manipulation, I can still interact with the whole thing. I can pinch zoom, but the 300 millisecond delay is gone. Other browsers, Chrome this is Mozilla, are thinking about maybe not pointer events in full, but at least just this bit. They're pushing it through to implement that. Same with Chrome. Apple are actually thinking about it, which is interesting. We followed that the other day. Mousemove Not Tracking. Yes, I can basically just patch that with using touch action. I can say I'm tracking mouse move. Touch action none means, keep firing it, don't scroll. You can do multi-touch, and now I'm really pushing my time here. There is advanced topics about pointer capturing, which I'm not even going to attempt. Browsers that are going to try and implement pointer events have a little bit of a problem now because the models between touch events and pointer events are different. We've seen where the delay happens and everything else. It could mean that browsers from now on will start having don't fire touch events and vice versa, maybe. So we're ahead with a bit of pain with browsers now implementing pointer events, particularly for backwards compatibility. That's being worked on at the W3C. There's a community group. I'm also part of that. And there's people from Chrome and Mozilla trying to untangle how can we actually do this in the best way. There are polyfills, hand.js by Microsoft. You can actually start coding pointer events today and just drop that in, and it will fire the correct things. It also passes your CSS to look for touch action, so it's quite cute. So you can start using the advantages of pointer events even today with polyfills. If you like your frameworks to have 800 megabytes, you can go for Polymer. No, I exaggerate. You can do that. There is an actual pointer events bit for Polymer. It does use, instead of touch action CSS, you have to actually use, in their model, an attribute because of the way they handle elements in Polymer. But that's fair enough. There's utility libraries. The cutest one I found was Hammer. Really good stuff. You can touch this. And Hammer's kind of taking it one level further in abstraction. It doesn't kind of polyfill and you work with pointer events. I quite like this because it kind of takes it one level further. Usually you want to detect, was this a swipe or was this a pinch zoom or something? So it gives you kind of synthetic events that are more closely related to what the user's intention is, rather than being very down in the events themselves and looking at variables and calculating distances. So it's quite a nice library. I'm sure jQuery Mobile and Sencha Touch are reasonably good with that kind of abstraction as well. I'd check if they also support pointer events. I'm not 100% sure. And if they don't make stupid assumptions like, oh, it has touch support, it must be a mobile device. Yeah. Debugging and testing, you can, there's various things here. There's inaccurate emulation happening. If you're just doing testing on a non-touch device and enable touch emulation, say in Chrome, it fires the wrong event sequence. If you're doing it in Firefox, it still fires mouse events when it shouldn't. So just be careful how you test it. Ideally, test on a real device. And inaccurate implementations. Firefox doesn't actually have touch events or pointer events enabled by default on a, say, Windows 8 laptop with touchscreen. You can force it to be enabled, but prepare for pain, because the events are actually nowhere near what they should be. You can, yeah, and as I said, in the nightly, you can enable pointer events as well. Further reading. And only about 3 people that were born in that year will know what this is about. So you've got the touch. And get in touch if you've got any further questions. And I managed to probably now have 1 minute of question time. Thank you very much.
That was fascinating. Jesus
You're just
Christ.
saying that.
Good job.
Thank you.
So many questions. Oh my God.
So many questions. You can ask me at lunch if you want.
Later for all the ones that we don't get through. What's the strangest touch-related bug that you have found?
Oh, well, I did, as part of the discussion I had with the working group about is keyboard actually a pointer, I still think it is, because as I said, you're moving, say, tab and shift tab, you're moving a visual focus, and it's a way of indicating as a user, I want to interact with this thing. So to my mind, that's a pointer. But there was some discussion about, oh no, it's not, because it doesn't have coordinates. When you're using keyboard to navigate, it's great, but you don't get coordinates. Well, that annoyed me because they had a point. So I went off and actually tested stuff, and I found that there are some combinations, particularly of, say, a screen reader, where you traditionally use a keyboard, or if it's on a touch device, you swipe left, swipe right to do effectively a tab and shift tab. It actually does fire coordinates, and quite sanely, particularly in Firefox, it sends the geometric mean of the center point of the elements that you activated. So the lines become even blurrier there, and I found that interesting. Maybe not a bug as such, but some browsers don't send anything. Old Opera, when it was still Presto-based back in the day, before they fired me. I'm not bitter. I've still got their T-shirt, though. It's good stuff. Opera, when you use spatial navigation, their special way of moving, particularly for TV, consistent in the weirdness. So it's kind of that stuff. And I'm probably a masochist, because as soon as I test something like that and I find one weird device that does something weird, I'm really happy because I can add an extra line on my testing tables. So There you go.
All right. So one of the questions is regarding Bootstrap and wreaking all sorts of havoc with regards to events in general, and buttons losing state and whatever. Do you have any experience with?
I have to admit, I've read just yesterday something about stop propagation and how that can be a complete nightmare in certain situations, even with simple Bootstrap stuff. I have to admit, I've not looked into it myself. 90% of my tests are really bare bones. Here's a button element, I'm listening to the events, and I'm doing it. If there is something that's nicely reproducible, send it my way if you find some stuff like that. I'm always interested in trying to untangle things. It can lead to a nice article. And I've been working a little bit with Bootstrap as well, kind of committing changes, mainly for the accessibility side of things, making sure that keyboard support works reasonably well. So if I find anything that's easily patchable, I might even push it. So yeah, if you find anything kind of touch related, pointer events related, that's weird, point me in the direction.
Is there anything on touch sensitivity?
In the pointer events specification, there is a value of pressure that is part of the extended attributes that you get. If the device doesn't have any pressure sensitivity, it's specified that it should always return 0.5. So it's from 0 to 1, a floating value. 0.5 is kind of the in-between, but certain devices, I haven't had a chance to play with a stylus on something like a Surface, but I hear that there it's actually implemented. So depending on how hard you press the stylus, you will get different values ranging from 0 to 1. So you can use that again as an extra indicator if you want to do, I don't know, drawing application, that sort of stuff, yeah. And you also get tilt when you use a stylus, which again, I haven't had a chance to test, but the spec defines exactly what's the X tilt, what's the Y tilt. So potentially, it allows you to do some very clever stuff in pointer events.
Good. That's so many fascinating questions. Thank you very much. A short one, how are multi-touch trackpads, for example, handled?
They are, from my experience, they don't get to the page. The multi-touching, say a Magic Trackpad and stuff, that's handled directly by the OS. You do not get individual touch points going down to the browser. The browser only sees whatever the mouse pointer is. So that's abstracted at OS level. You don't get to that point, unfortunately. I've played around. I've actually got it in my backpack. I've got a Leap Motion, which is an interesting device because it doesn't perform near enough as well as it showed in the initial Kickstarter kind of demo. So I've played with it for about 2 hours, and I put it in the box and forgot about it until a few days ago. And there you use custom events, but you can kind of, because it runs its own server locally, and you can poll the individual finger movements. So that's an interesting one. And I seem to remember, although I need to confirm it, that the guy from Microsoft who works on the pointer event stuff, Jacob Rossi, was saying something cryptic the other day, and I think he's written a polyfill that basically maps the custom events that you get with Leap Motion to actual pointer events. So you could do in-air multi-touch kind of stuff. So I'm still pressing him on that one. But in theory, it shouldn't be difficult because you get the individual points, just fire synthetic pointer events from that. So.
Right, but yeah, it's just a
Yeah.
matter of
So
pushing it through.
it's a potential thing, and things I'll just mention it now. Just the other day, Xbox One, you've got the Kinect, and you've got IE 11 effectively on Xbox to navigate with your hand. That fires pointer events as well. So if you're doing things with pointer events, mapped to touch, unfortunately, so it kind of pretends to be a touch. But you do get the X and Y. So if you're writing your code to listen for pointer events, you've got compatibility with those kind of scenarios as well. You could argue that's because the hardware and the OS there kind of emulate a touch point through the Kinect stuff, but it opens the door for it.
Right, two quick ones on
Yep.
pointer events. One is, do they solve all, like when you expand all everything else and has issues, do pointer events, aside from not being picked up by Apple, do they?
The big problems that you still have that I didn't touch upon is hover-based stuff. If you've got a website that relies completely on things appearing and disappearing on hover, you're going to have a bad time on touch devices, historically already. I mean, I come from the accessibility side. We already, for years, trying to explain to developers, don't just listen to mouse over, because somebody with a keyboard comes along. At least react to focus, but you might have to change your code slightly to do similar thing when keyboard focus comes to an element, even if it's just a drop-down menu.
Well, everybody knows the XKCD hidden message problem on mobile.
Yeah,
right?
that kind of stuff, exactly. That's only going to get worse, as more and more touch devices are out and about. That is more of a UX and UI kind of issue. But technically, I think at least pointer events give you a slightly better basis from which to then work on. Already for simple things, you don't have to mess about so much with JavaScript. Right. So let the UXers and the UIers and the designers work it out. And at least pointer events give you a better way of then implementing it, in my opinion, anyway.
Right. And I guess that's the same answer then. How about native gesture support in pointer events, or is that a level on top of it?
Pointer events in IE, they actually have their own gesture kind of APIs, the same way that iOS has got gestures. But in the same way that iOS has got gestures, nobody else seems to be interested in the Microsoft pointer gesture stuff. And that's also not part of the spec that they submitted, so they're kind of keeping that bit close to their heart. And unless you're doing something specific for IE, which also includes Xbox, obviously, you don't really get the gesture stuff. So you still have to use something like Hammer, which Hammer actually supports pointer events. Oh, thank you.
If you want.
No.
Have your Coke. The last one is a bit like philosophical / linguistic. Like talking about click with hand is not quite correct. Talking about touch with with that kind of thing is not correct.
Yeah.
So how does other terms that we're using for talking about this and defining this, are they accurate enough? Or are they good enough for describing what we're actually doing? Or is there a need for I don't know? Or are we are we limiting ourselves in language and thinking by the vocabulary that we have?
Well, the problem isn't new. Again, I'll go back to my accessibility kind of roots and say that for years we've had arguments that click should really be called activate, because click is fired even on keyboard and it's not really a click as such. I think that there's a lot of legacy. If we started right now, we'd probably, instead of click, call it activate or something like that, which is a little bit more generic. But you can kind of end up in weird, making up new terms, which if you look at some of the HTML5 and CSS latest stuff, they feel the need to invent new weird terms. And that creates more problems because then nobody knows what that actually means. So it's kind of a halfway house. Some stuff is a bit inadequate. Some terms are a bit not ideal, but there's a lot of legacy out there. And
Right, cool. I think that wraps it up. Thank you very much. One more round of applause.
And you can eat now. Yay!